The crystal chandeliers of Lou Bijou cast an opulent glow on the meticulously polished silverware. Alexander Stone, a man carved from ambition and tailored in Savile Row, checked his Rolex for what felt like the 100th time. At 38, he helmed Stone Industries, a titan of industry worth more than some small nations. Yet he was drowning in a sea of weary routine. This blind date, the brainchild of his relentlessly optimistic assistant, Jennifer, was slated to be his last foray into the treacherous waters of romance. After tonight, I'm officially retiring from this charade, he muttered under his breath, the words barely audible above the clinking of champagne flutes. Relationships simply aren't in my cards. Just one more, Jennifer had pleaded, her voice dripping with persuasive hope. Elena is different, Alexander. She's not like the others. Please just give her a chance. Alexander had traversed this well-worn path before. Each woman Jennifer deemed worthy seemed to covet the same glittering prizes. His wealth, his prestige, the keys to his penthouse kingdom. But never him. Never the man beneath the tailored suits and the CEO title. He resolved to grant this Elena exactly 30 minutes of his precious time. After that, he'd conjure some urgent business matter, offer a perfunctory apology, and retreat to the sanctuary of his office, where contracts and spreadsheets offered a far more reliable form of companionship. As the minutes ticked by, a woman entered the restaurant, her silhouette briefly catching Alexander's eye. He barely registered her presence, his gaze already drifting back to the intricate details of the wine list. But something made him look again. She wasn't adorned in designer labels or dripping in diamonds. Instead, she wore a simple sundress, cream-colored and unpretentious. Her brown hair, pulled back in a loose, effortless style, framed a face that was both earnest and undeniably attractive. A jarring, metallic clang echoed through the air as the gray and white German shepherd, a whirlwind of desperation, hurled himself against the unforgiving steel of the kennel door. Just moments before, the dog had reacted violently to an animal control officer, his teeth flashing in a display that led to an immediate, grim decree: euthanasia. "What do you mean?" Jared had asked, his voice tight with a dread he couldn't quite articulate. At that precise instant, a beat-up Ford pickup, a relic from the 1990s, coughed and sputtered, its engine dying an uncharacteristic death. Franklin, a man swallowed by solitude for 15 years, a man who hadn't willingly stopped his truck for anything, killed the ignition. He emerged from the cab, his movements slow, deliberate, and ignored the officer's increasingly frantic shouts. His gaze, unwavering and intense, was fixed on the dog. His face, usually weathered and impassive, was now strikingly pale. He wasn't merely seeing a panicked animal. He was recognizing a chilling harbinger, a sign he had witnessed only once before, an omen that preceded the earth-shattering detonation in Afghanistan. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence within Franklin's cabin was a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket woven from years of isolation. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a palpable presence, the sound of 15 years ticking by, each day a deliberate act of lonely survival. The only sounds that dared to pierce this self-imposed vacuum were the hiss of the ancient wood stove during the brutal winter months and the infrequent growl of his truck's engine, a ritual that occurred a mere 4 times a year. Today was one of those days. Franklin stood motionless by the cabin's solitary window, watching the sun paint the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range with the fiery hues of dawn. He was a man etched from the very landscape he inhabited, a man in his mid-50s, tall and sculpted from a lean, hard-working mold that had stubbornly resisted the softening effects of age. His brown hair, long enough to graze his collar, was generously streaked with silver at the temples. A thick, slightly untamed beard and mustache concealed a face that resembled a carving from sun-baked pine, scored with the deep lines of hardship, but his eyes, when he deigned to focus them on another human being, held no trace of cruelty. He pulled on his worn boots, the leather cracked and darkened by years of faithful service. He ran a calloused hand through his hair, settled a well-worn cap on his head, and shrugged into his aged brown leather jacket. He left it unzipped, revealing the red and dark navy plaid shirt beneath. He didn't consult a list. After 15 years, the list was an indelible scar etched into his memory. Flour, salt, coffee, kerosene, and truck fuel. Anything beyond that was a luxury, and luxury was a complication he couldn't afford. He had retreated to these mountains in 2005, seeking an altitude high enough to escape the man he had been, the memories that haunted his waking hours. He abandoned the world below, and in return the world had, for the most part, honored the unspoken agreement to leave him undisturbed. His truck, a vintage model from the 1990s, voiced its vehement protest against the frigid morning air with a series of groans and rattles, but the engine reluctantly turned over. Franklin backed onto the gravel track, his movements precise and economical, honed by years of solitude. The drive down the mountain was a breathtaking spectacle, a winding descent through groves of aspen and pine that eventually opened onto the vast, windswept expanse of the high desert mesa. But Franklin saw none of it. His focus was solely on the road, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze distant and inward. He drove toward the outskirts of Taos, a town that thrived on its vibrant art scene, bustling tourism, and rich history, none of which held the slightest interest for him. He meticulously timed his trips to avoid the throngs of tourists and weekenders. A Tuesday morning in the off-season was usually a safe bet. His destination was an old, unassuming feed and supply store on the edge of town, a place that reeked of dust and fertilizer and didn't pry into his affairs. To reach it, however, he had to pass the county animal shelter. It was the least favorite part of his bi-monthly pilgrimage. He loathed the place. It was a concrete monument to broken promises and shattered lives, a repository of endings. He consciously avoided looking at it directly, fixing his gaze on the opposite side of the road, on the seemingly endless expanse of sagebrush stretching toward the horizon, and pressed down a little harder on the accelerator. But today he couldn't. The sound hit him first, a brutal assault that pierced through the closed windows of his truck. It wasn't the usual chorus of sad yelps and mournful howls that typically emanated from the shelter. This was a raw, percussive sound, the frantic barking of a creature driven to the edge, punctuated by a heavy, rhythmic slam. It was the unmistakable sound of a large body repeatedly throwing itself against metal. Then, a man's sharp cry of pain. Against every instinct he had painstakingly cultivated over the past 15 years, Franklin slowed the truck. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder, a mere 50 yards from the shelter's chain-link gate. He saw two men. One, clad in a county uniform, was stumbling backward from a transport kennel positioned on the side of a truck. It was David, an animal control officer, and he was clutching his forearm, his face pale with shock and a simmering anger. Blood was already seeping through the thick canvas of his sleeve. The other man, older and bearing the weary countenance of someone who had witnessed too much, was Jared, the shelter director. "David, are you?" "That's it, Jared. It's done." David's voice was strained with pain and resentment. "That thing is rabid. I want it euthanized now. I'm not putting it in the kennels. You can't make me." Franklin's gaze shifted from the men to the transport kennel. The source of the commotion was a chaotic blur of gray and white fur. A large German shepherd thrashing inside the cage with a terrifying, mindless violence. It would lunge with every ounce of its considerable strength, hit the metal door with a sickening thud, spin in a frenzy, and lunge again. But it wasn't attacking, not in the traditional sense. It was trying to escape, desperately trying to break free from an invisible prison that only it could perceive. Franklin's hand, which had been resting idly on the gearshift, tightened into a fist. "Turn around." The voice in his head hissed, the same voice that had kept him alive and relatively sane for the past 15 years. "Not your problem, not your world. Drive away." This was precisely what he had fled the world to escape: the chaos, the pain, the responsibility. He shifted the truck into gear and his foot instinctively moved toward the accelerator. He physically turned his head, preparing to merge back onto the road. He would go to the store, gather his supplies, and be back on his mountain before noon. He stole one last glance in his side mirror, and he froze. His foot instinctively came off the pedal. The truck idled, its engine rumbling softly. Something was profoundly wrong with the dog's posture. He was a handler, he knew dogs. He had lived, breathed, and slept dogs for 2 decades of his life. This wasn't just rage. It was something far more primal. He killed the engine, the sudden silence in the cab amplifying the turmoil within him. He got out. He stood by his truck, resolutely ignoring the shouts emanating from David. He watched the dog, and his blood ran cold. The dog's eyes weren't narrowed in aggressive focus. They were wide, the pupils blown, revealing the whites all around in a disturbing display of fear. Its ears weren't forward, challenging. They were pinned flat back against its skull, so flat they almost disappeared into the ruff of its neck. Its body was trembling, not with anger, but with a deep, vibrating terror. But it was the head that was the part that stopped Franklin's heart cold. The dog wasn't focused on the men. It wasn't focused on the kennel door it was so desperately trying to breach. Between lunges, its head snapped up, its muzzle pointing skyward, scanning the roofline of the shelter, scanning the empty blue horizon as if the threat wasn't directly in front of it, but was descending from above. "He's scanning," Franklin whispered, the words lost in the wind. "He's looking for the high ground." The acrid smell of diesel and hot dust filled his nostrils, and the bright New Mexico morning dissolved into a hazy memory. It was 2005. The oppressive heat was a physical weight, pressing down on him. He was in Kandahar, the air thick with the ever-present dust of pulverized earth. He was walking point 20 feet behind Max, his canine partner, his other half. Max, a magnificent black and tan shepherd, had been working the scent line for half a mile. Suddenly, Max stopped. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He froze, every muscle coiled tight. His eyes went wide, his ears pinned flat, and his head snapped up, scanning the rooftops of the mud brick compound they were approaching. Franklin had instinctively grabbed his radio. Max's alerting high threat. He's scanning the rooftops. A sharp click echoed from a nearby speaker, followed by the unmistakable whistle of an incoming mortar. The world exploded in a blinding flash of fire and dust. Franklin stood by his truck, the sound of David shouting a distant, muffled buzz. He was shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't breathe. He wasn't seeing a transport kennel. He was seeing a mud brick wall crumbling before his eyes. He wasn't seeing a gray and white shepherd. He was seeing Max, frozen in that last, terrible moment of certainty. The dog in the kennel lunged again, and its high-pitched cry of terror wasn't just a bark. It was a sound of profound, soul-crushing trauma. It was the precise, specialized PTSD response of a dog trained for combat, a dog who had learned, through brutal experience, that threats often came from above. "It's not your problem," Franklin told himself, his voice a mere whisper. But it was a lie. The memory had anchored him, dragging him back to a past he had desperately tried to bury. The ghost of Max in that kennel wouldn't let him leave. David was still yelling, "Get the pole! We're putting it down right here." Franklin's legs felt like lead, but he moved, propelled by a force he couldn't resist. He took one heavy step, not back toward the sanctuary of the mountain, but toward Jared. "Wait," Franklin said, the word a rusty croak. It was the first word he had spoken to a stranger in over a year, and the sound of his own voice was as shocking as the scene unfolding before him. The word hung in the air, thin and rough from disuse. "Wait!" David froze, his hand halfway to a catchpole leaning against the shelter wall. Jared, the shelter director, turned his full attention to the unexpected arrival. He knew of this man. Everyone in town did. Franklin, the mountain man, the recluse who bought his supplies in bulk and spoke to no one. In 5 years as director, Jared had never heard him utter a single word. Franklin took a slow step forward, his old work boots silent on the gravel. He wore the uniform Jared always saw him in. Faded blue jeans, a worn brown leather jacket over a plaid shirt, and a cap pulled low over his brow. He looked lean, healthy, and profoundly tired. "Can I help you?" Jared asked, his voice defaulting to the professional calm he'd perfected during his years as a police captain. Franklin's gaze remained fixed, not on Jared, but on the transport kennel. The shepherd inside had momentarily paused its assault, its flanks heaving, its chest covered in drool and foam. "The dog," Franklin said, his voice a low rasp. "Where did it come from?" "Owner surrender this morning," Jared said, stepping subtly between Franklin and the agitated David. "Said he was vicious. Looks like he was right. He just put one of my best officers out of commission." David, clutching his bleeding arm, spat onto the gravel. "Vicious? That thing is a menace, Jared. Tried to take my arm off. It needs to be put down before it hurts someone else. I want it done now." Franklin ignored David completely, his eyes locked on the kennel. He saw the unadulterated terror in the dog's eyes. He saw the way its paws were bleeding from clawing at the metal. He saw the ghost of Max staring back at him. "He's not vicious," Franklin stated, his voice flat and unwavering. "It wasn't an opinion. It was a diagnosis. He's terrified." Jared let out a long, weary sigh. He'd heard this before from well-meaning volunteers who saw potential in every lost cause. "Son, terrified, vicious. It often looks the same from this side of the bars. I've been doing this for 20 years, first on the force, now here. I know the look. That dog," he motioned toward the kennel, "is beyond saving. He's too far gone. He's a liability we can't afford and a danger to my staff. The kindest thing we can do now is put him down humanely." A heavy silence settled over the scene. Franklin looked from the dog to Jared, then back to the dog. He saw the finality in Jared's eyes, the anger in David's, and the raw, unadulterated panic in Wolf's. He felt the old, familiar weight of failure pressing down on him, the same weight that had crushed him in 2005. He had failed Max. He had run from the world. And now, the first time he'd stopped running, he was being told to walk away from this, too. "Let me try," Franklin said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. David let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Try what? Get yourself killed? That shepherd will rip your throat out, old man." Jared just looked confused. The situation had veered from a standard emergency to something altogether strange. "Mr. Franklin, isn't it? Try what exactly? What do you do?" Franklin's jaw tightened. He hadn't spoken those words aloud to another person since he'd buried his uniform. The admission felt like tearing open a long-healed scar. "I was a handler," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "K9. The two letters hung in the air, subtly altering the atmosphere. David's scoffing died in his throat. Jared, the ex-cop, suddenly saw the stranger in a new light. He saw the way Franklin stood, not aggressively, but perfectly balanced, ready to react to any threat. He saw the quiet authority that had been there all along, hidden beneath the beard and the isolation. "K9, Jared repeated, tasting the word, turning it over in his mind. He made a decision. "David, go to the clinic. Get that arm stitched up. That's an order." "But Jared, the dog." "I will handle the dog. Go." Jared's voice had the unmistakable steel of a man accustomed to being obeyed. David, glaring at Franklin, finally turned and stalked toward his truck, presumably to drive himself to the urgent care clinic. Jared turned back to Franklin. "He's right about one thing. There's a risk I can't take. I cannot let you in that kennel. My insurance, my county board, they'd shut me down." Franklin nodded slowly. "I don't need to go in. He's still in the transport unit. Just leave him. Leave him be. Just give me some space. And, do you have a stool? A simple wooden stool?" Inside the shelter's small front office, Meredith, the new veterinary technician, had been watching the entire drama unfold through the blinds. She had her hand clamped over her mouth, horrified by David's injury and the sheer violence emanating from the dog. She was young, idealistic, and dreading what came next. The needle and the quiet, heavy walk to the freezer. Now she watched, completely baffled, as her boss, Jared, went to the feed supply shed and retrieved an old, three-legged milking stool. She watched as Franklin took the stool, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked to a spot on the gravel about 10 feet from the transport kennel on the truck. He didn't face the dog directly. He positioned himself so he was partially turned away, offering his side, not a direct, confrontational stance. The dog, who had been momentarily quiet, watching the exchange, renewed its panicked assault. Seeing this new human settle in, it began to bark, a deep, explosive sound of terror that seemed to shake the entire truck. It lunged at the bars, hitting the metal with a heavy, solid thud. Franklin did not flinch. He didn't react. He didn't even look. From the deep inner pocket of his leather jacket, Franklin produced a very old, dog-eared paperback. The cover was missing, and the pages were yellowed and brittle with age. He opened it to a marked page and began to read. Or at least he appeared to read. His eyes were focused on the page, but his entire being, every nerve, was attuned to the animal 10 feet away. He was an island of absolute calm in the center of the storm. Inside the office, Meredith turned to Jared, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. What is he doing? That dog is going to give itself a heart attack. He's ignoring it. No, Jared said. His eyes narrowed in intense observation. He's not ignoring it. He's outlasting it. Watch. The shepherd's frantic rhythm began to break. It would lunge, bark, and slam against the metal, only to be met with nothing. No yelling, no rattling pole, no threat, just the scent of a calm man and the whisper of the wind. It lunged again, barked, then stopped abruptly. It stared intently at the man. The man turned a page. The dog let out a frustrated, confused noise, half bark, half whine. It was being met with a language it didn't understand. Absolute neutrality. The furious barking gradually subsided into a low, rumbling growl. The dog was still coiled, a spring of terror waiting to be released, but the blind panic was beginning to fade. Franklin, without looking up, slowly turned another page. The growling stopped altogether. The shepherd was panting now, its sides wet, its tongue lolling out. It was exhausted. It slid down onto its belly, but its head remained up, its ears swiveling, its eyes locked on the strange, quiet man. Confusion had replaced terror. This human was breaking all the rules. He wasn't a threat, he wasn't a comfort. He was just there. The dog's rapid, shallow breathing began to deepen. It was shifting from pure fight-or-flight panic to tense, exhausted observation. Franklin sat there for an hour. The sun climbed higher, warming the gravel. He turned 3 more pages. The only sounds were the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional jingle of a tag from the main kennel building. Finally, Franklin slowly closed his book. He placed it carefully back in his pocket. He stood up, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The dog instantly tensed, scrambling to its feet, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. Franklin didn't look at it. He picked up the stool, keeping his back mostly to the animal, and walked back toward the office. He stopped in front of Jared, who had come outside to meet him. "That was something," Jared said, unsure what else to say. "What now?" Franklin looked past him, up toward the mountains that were his refuge. "I'll be back tomorrow." He walked to his truck, climbed in, and started the engine. He drove away, leaving Jared and Meredith staring after him in stunned silence. And in the transport kennel, Wolf, the gray and white shepherd, lay down in the first true, heavy silence he had known in days, his eyes never leaving the spot where the silent man had been. He returned the next morning just as the sun was clearing the mountains. The old truck pulled into the same spot. Jared, sipping coffee by the office door, gave a single, short nod. Franklin nodded back. The acknowledgement was all the conversation they needed. Jared had moved the gray shepherd out of the transport unit and into a secure concrete kennel run in the quarantine wing. It was isolated, giving the dog space while ensuring staff safety. The 3-legged stool was waiting for Franklin right by the entrance to the wing. Franklin picked it up and walked to the run. Wolf was already a storm of noise. The moment he'd seen the truck, The deep, percussive barking had started anew. He was launching himself at the chain-link gate. His teeth bared, the sound a desperate rattling slam of metal on metal. Franklin did exactly what he had done the day before. He placed the stool 10 feet away, sat down, turned his body partially away, and opened his book. He read, or he appeared to read. He tracked the lines on the page, but his senses were focused entirely on the animal. The frantic barking continued for 20 minutes. Then, just like before, it faltered. The rhythm broke. The dog was being met with infuriating, incomprehensible calm. The bark subsided into low, chest-rumbling growls. Wolf backed away from the gate, his paws bleeding slightly onto the concrete. He retreated to the far corner, lay down, but kept his head up, eyes locked on the silent man. Franklin turned a page. This was their new routine. It held for 2 more days. Franklin arrived. Wolf exploded in a show of terror and defensive fury. Franklin sat. The fury would exhaust itself, burning out against the man's profound stillness. Then silence, heavy and tense, would stretch for hours, and then Franklin would leave. On the 3rd day of this ritual, a Friday, something changed. The initial explosion from Wolf was shorter. It lasted only 5 minutes. When the dog retreated to his corner, he lay down and put his head on his paws, though every muscle in his body remained coiled, ready to spring. Franklin watched him from the corner of his eye. He sensed the subtle shift. The dog was no longer just panicked. He was frustrated. He was waiting for the next step, for the threat that always eventually came. Franklin slowly closed his book and placed it on the gravel beside the stool. He looked at the dog, not directly in the eyes, that was a challenge, but at his ears. He had spent the last 3 days reliving Kandahar, reliving Max. He remembered the language they had shared, a private world built on German commands and subtle shifts in weight, a language of trust he hadn't spoken in 15 years. His throat felt thick, rusty. "Sits," he said. The word was a low, rough murmur, barely louder than the wind. Wolf's head snapped up. His ears, which had been pinned back in fear, instantly shot forward, swiveling like radar dishes, trying to triangulate the sound. He didn't sit. He scrambled to his feet, confused. He knew that word. It was buried deep beneath the trauma, but it was there, flickering like a dying ember. Franklin kept his voice low, rhythmic, almost like a prayer, using the tones of calm praise, not sharp command. "Sits, Guter Junge." Sits. "Good boy." Wolf's entire body was a question mark. He backed up, hit the wall, and let out a single, confused bark. "Platz," Franklin murmured, the word aching in his chest. "Down." He remembered saying it to Max in the belly of a C-130, the vibration of the floor, Max's warm body a solid presence against his leg. "Bleeb," Franklin whispered. "Stay." He wasn't commanding this dog. He was communing with a ghost. He was speaking to the soldier he knew was trapped inside that terrified animal. Wolf paced, whining, the sounds of his trauma fighting with the muscle memory of his training. From the office, Meredith watched, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. She had witnessed Franklin's strange routine, but today she heard the words. She saw the dog's immediate electric reaction. She made a decision. She grabbed a second mug, filled it, and walked outside. Franklin heard her approach on the gravel, and his entire body tensed. He hated intrusions. He was in a delicate, fragile space, and this was an interruption he didn't need. "Mr. Franklin." He didn't turn. "Ma'am." Meredith stopped a few feet away. "I brought you some coffee. It's cold out here. You haven't moved in hours." He slowly turned. He saw the young woman, her face open and kind, her eyes filled with a concern that wasn't pity. He hesitated, then took the mug. "Thank you." "I heard you," she said, nodding toward the kennel. "The German. I think you're right about him. I think I know why you're right." Franklin looked at her, his brows furrowed. "He was surrendered," Meredith said, lowering her voice. "5 days ago. The man who brought him in, he was awful. He stormed in, dragged the dog by a choke chain, and said he was broken and uncontrollable, said if we didn't take him, he'd shoot him. We had no choice. She took a breath, her voice trembling slightly. The man was angry. He threw a plastic sleeve of paperwork at the desk, said it was useless garbage. I'm the intake coordinator. I file the papers. Meredith reached into the pocket of her scrubs. She pulled out a folded clear plastic sleeve. I scanned the microchip. It was restricted, listed to a private security contractor, but these were his discharge papers. She handed them to Franklin. His hands, usually so steady, had a slight tremor as he took the papers through the plastic. He saw the Department of Defense emblem. He saw a DD Form 2209, the K-9 medical record. He saw the discharge certificate. K-9 ID W442. Name, Wolf. Status, military working dog, multipurpose canine. Discharged 2023. He was a soldier, Meredith whispered, tears welling in her eyes. He served, and he was adopted out to that man who did this to him. David, the officer. Franklin tracked down the dogbite victim, running his plates. The man, David, had a history of animal neglect charges. He had abused Franklin, the dog, beating a hero. Franklin stared at the files, a slow, icy rage eclipsing his grief. He'd witnessed this callous disregard before. Military working dogs were lauded as heroes in combat zones. Yet, if they developed PTSD or were otherwise discharged, they were often callously discarded, shuffled between owners until they were utterly broken. He glanced at Wolf, huddled in the corner, still trembling. This wasn't just a dog. He was more than a mere reflection of Max. He was one of their own. The feeling of a distant connection, a responsibility he couldn't shirk, settled upon him like a physical weight. He wasn't merely saving a dog. He was saving a fellow veteran. He returned the coffee mug to Meredith. Thank you, ma'am, for the coffee and for this information. He turned and walked towards his truck. Meredith initially assumed he was leaving, his stiff shoulders suggesting defeat. But instead of opening the driver's side door, he opened the passenger side. From a small cooler on the floor, he retrieved a foil-wrapped packet. He walked back to Wolf's kennel. The dog tensed, anticipating a threat. Franklin knelt, oblivious to the filth staining the concrete. He didn't toss the food at him. He didn't attempt to force it. He spoke in a gentle, soothing tone. Gatera, this is for a good boy. This is for you. He carefully slid the small packet, containing high-value, air-dried liver treats he'd prepared himself, just inside the gate. It sat there, a silent offering. Then he retreated. He retrieved his stool, returned to his spot, and opened his book. He afforded the dog the dignity of distance. Wolf stared at the packet. He looked at Franklin. He glanced back at the packet, his black nose twitching. He was clearly starving, but his fear was more powerful. He paced, whining, alternating his gaze between the food and the man. The standoff lasted 2 agonizing hours. Finally, the sun began its descent behind the shelter roof. It was time. Franklin closed his book. He stood, placed the stool against the wall, and walked towards his truck, not looking back. The next morning, Franklin's first act upon arriving was to check the kennel. The foil packet was gone, replaced by tiny, torn shreds licked clean. Franklin nodded once, a subtle sign of acknowledgement. He walked to the storage building, retrieved his stool, and sat down. He pulled his book from his pocket and a new foil packet from his other pocket, placing it on the ground beside him, waiting. For 5 days, this new routine persisted. It was a fragile piece, built on silence and liver treats. Franklin would arrive just after dawn. Wolf would be waiting, no longer erupting in panic, but standing tense at the back of his run, emitting a low, anxious whine that resonated with unspoken trauma. Franklin would set his stool down. He had moved it closer, now only about 6 feet from the gate, and he'd added a crucial new step. He would sit, book in hand, and slowly, over the course of an hour, extend his left hand, resting it palm out against the chain-link fence. He wouldn't look at the dog. He simply offered his scent, a stationary, non-threatening presence. Wolf's reaction was a battle within himself. He would pace, sniff, and emit short, frustrated barks, as if furious at his own inability to chase this calm man away. But each day his curiosity would triumph. He would creep closer, his belly low to the ground, until he was just on the other side of the fence. He would sniff the air near Franklin's hand, his black nose twitching, before his own fear sent him skittering back to the corner. Franklin never moved. He simply sat, his hand on the wire, a living statue of patience. Meredith observed this slow, painful dance each morning from the office window, her heart caught between hope and despair. She had seen Franklin slide the morning's foil packet under the gate and witnessed Wolf wait only 10 minutes, not 2 hours, before snatching it when he believed Franklin was absorbed in his book. It was progress, slow and agonizing but undeniably real. But on the morning of the 6th day, the fragile peace was shattered. The sound of a truck pulling into the gravel lot made Franklin look up. It wasn't Jared's quiet sedan. The crunch of the tires was heavy and aggressive. A county vehicle, its logo stark against the door, screeched to a halt. David emerged. He was wearing his uniform, but his arm was encased in a heavy white bandage, his hand emerging swollen and blue. He clutched a clipboard in his good hand, holding it to his chest like a shield. His face was pale, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and a deep, unsettling fear. The moment Wolf saw him, the progress of the last 5 days vanished. The dog lunged, a furious, desperate explosion of gray and white. He slammed against the gate with a deafening rattle, his teeth bared, snarling and snapping at the man who was the source of his pain, both past and present. David flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk backward. That reflexive display of fear seemed to ignite his anger. "See!" he shouted, not to Franklin, but to the world at large. "Still a monster. I told you, Jared. I told you." Jared emerged from the office, his face grim. He had clearly been expecting this. "David, calm down. You're agitating him." "I'm agitating him?" David's voice cracked. He held up the clipboard. "This is official, Jared. The report is filed. Aggression incident level 4. Mandatory euthanasia. Our insurance carrier got the report yesterday." He jabbed a finger toward the snarling dog. "They're threatening to drop the whole county contract, not just the shelter, the whole county. All because of that." Jared looked trapped. "David, we're making progress. This man, Franklin, he's a veteran handler. The dog is a former MWD. I don't care if he was a 4-star general." David shouted, his eyes wide. "He's a liability. The county board agrees. They held an emergency vote." He thrust the clipboard at Jared. "You have 7 days. That's the order." Franklin had stood up. The legs of his stool made a quiet scraping sound on the gravel, a sound that cut through the tense air. Wolf, hearing his protector move, fell silent, though his body was still coiled, trembling. 7 days for what? Franklin's voice was low, but it carried. David turned on him, his gaze sweeping over Franklin with contempt. 7 days until he's put down. That's the law. Behavioral euthanasia, and I'll be the one to sign the paper. It's my right as the victim." He smiled, a thin, bitter expression that held no victory, only pain. He slapped the clipboard against Jared's chest. "My shift starts next Monday. I expect it to be done." He turned, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust. Jared stared at the paper, his shoulders slumped. Franklin was staring at the kennel. Wolf had retreated to the corner, his failed charge leaving him panting and defeated. The weight of 15 years of Kandahar, of every failure, crashed down on Franklin. A timer, a 7-day deadline, a life he was responsible for, slipping through his fingers. He had run from this, and it had found him anyway. "Jared?" Meredith said, coming out of the office, her face pale. "He can't do that, can he?" "He just did," Jared said, his voice flat. He looked at Franklin. "He's right. The county holds the purse strings. My hands are tied. It's a legal order. 7 days, Franklin said, his voice hollow. It's not enough time. It's not enough time to heal him. Wait. Meredith stepped forward, her eyes scanning the official document in Jared's hand. She pointed to a subsection. Franklin, listen to me. Jared, look. It's not just a death warrant. She took the paper. The goal isn't to heal him. That's impossible. I read the fine print. She looked Franklin directly in the eye, her voice suddenly strong. The order is for euthanasia unless he can be deemed manageable for transfer. We don't have to make him a pet. We just have to prove he can be controlled. Franklin's gaze sharpened. Controlled? Yes, Meredith said, a new, frantic energy in her voice. He has to reliably accept a muzzle, and he has to walk on a leash without lunging from this kennel run to a transport vehicle. That's the loophole. If we can film that, if we can document that he is manageable, I can legally transfer him to a specialized MWD sanctuary in Colorado. Jared looked up, a spark of his old captain's mind igniting. The one outside Boulder? I've heard of it. They have specialists. Exactly, Meredith said. It's a long shot. He won't even let us near the gate with a bowl. Franklin looked at Wolf. The impossible abstract goal of healing vanished. In its place was a concrete, tangible mission. Muzzle, leash, walk. This he understood. This was a mission profile. Later that afternoon, the shelter was quiet. Franklin hadn't left. He was sitting on his stool, but his intensity was different. He was no longer just waiting, he was planning. Inside the office, Meredith was pacing. I just don't understand, David. How can he be so cruel? He hates that dog. Jared was at his desk, staring at the wall, his face a map of exhaustion. He doesn't hate the dog, Meredith. He's terrified, and he has a right to be. Meredith stopped pacing. What do you mean? About 5 years ago, Jared said, his voice low. Before I was director, David was the lead officer on a rescue, a savable pit mix. The owner had sworn it was just scared. David went in the house. The dog got him, took him down. It wasn't a bite. It was a mauling. Meredith's hand went to her mouth. 60 stitches in his leg, Jared continued. 40 in his arm. Nerve damage. He was out of work for 8 months. Doctor said he'd never have full use of that hand again. He proved them wrong, but it took everything he had. Jared, the dog. Jared said it was just scared. But scared dogs, abused dogs, they're the most dangerous. David came back to work. Everyone said he was a hero, but he's never been the same. He trusts rules, not instincts. He sees Wolf and he doesn't see a veteran. He sees the animal that almost cost him his arm, his career. He sees a monster. Jared stood and walked to the window, looking out at the two figures in the late afternoon sun. What's happening out there, Meredith? It's not a man versus a dog. It's Franklin's trauma versus David's trauma. And I'm stuck in the middle. He has 7 days. Outside, Franklin slowly attached a worn, black tactical muzzle to the end of a long, lightweight pole. He didn't try to touch Wolf. He simply held it out a few inches inside the gate, allowing the dog to sniff this new, strange object before pulling it back. The clock was ticking. The shelter now operated on 2 clocks. The real one on the wall and the one Franklin carried in his gut. 6 days remaining. He hadn't gone home. The 90-minute round trip up and down the mountain was a luxury of time he could no longer afford. He slept in the cab of his truck, reclined against the worn bench seat, waking every few hours as the temperature dropped, his bones aching. The first thing he did when the sun touched the peaks was get his stool. He was intensifying the therapy. He moved the stool closer. He was 4 feet from the gate now, well within the dog's recognized boundary. Wolf's reaction to this was electric. The low growl was constant. He couldn't relax. He paced in tight, frantic circles, but he wouldn't lunge. Franklin's calm was a shield the dog's aggression couldn't penetrate. Then came the muzzle. Franklin had brought it on day 6, a black basket-style tactical muzzle, the kind used in MWD training. He had attached it to a simple wooden pole, not as a weapon but as an extension, a tool for desensitization. He sat on his stool, his book unopened in his lap. He slowly, quietly, pushed the pole through the chain link, the muzzle resting on the concrete 6 inches inside the run. Wolf's reaction was immediate. He scrambled to the back wall, his claws scraping against the floor. A high-pitched, terrified whine escaped his throat. He stared at the muzzle, his entire body trembling. This was the tool of his abuser. This was the precursor to pain. Franklin held it there. He said nothing. He just held it motionless for an hour. It was a battle of wills, but not of aggression. It was Franklin's patience versus the dog's trauma. By midday, Wolf's fear had exhausted him. He was still in the corner, but his head was down. He would watch the muzzle, then look at Franklin. Muzzle. Man, muzzle. Man. His traumatized brain was trying to connect the two. The muzzle was terror. But the man was liver treats. The man was the low, calm voice. The man was the first human who hadn't tried to hurt him. This was the conflict that Franklin had to win. He slowly pulled the muzzle back out. The moment it vanished, the tension in Wolf's body eased by half. Then Franklin did the second hardest thing. He put his left hand, bare, against the chain link gate. Wolf watched him. He crept forward a few steps. He sniffed the air. He was close enough to smell the leather of Franklin's jacket, the scent of pine smoke from his clothes, the faint salty smell of his skin. The dog crept closer. He stretched his neck out, his black nose twitching just an inch from the wire. He was sniffing the hand. Franklin didn't move. He didn't breathe. Wolf's tongue, pink and tentative, darted out and licked the wire where Franklin's hand rested. Then, terrified by his own bravery, the dog scrambled back to the corner. Franklin let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He stayed for another 2 hours, his hand on the gate, a silent promise. The day ended, 5 days remaining. The shelter emptied out. The volunteers left. Jared went home, giving Franklin a tired salute as he locked the front gate. Only Meredith stayed. She was in the clinic, working late, catching up on paperwork that had piled up during the week's drama. The quiet hum of the building's fluorescent lights was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional sad bark from the main adoption wing. Around 9 o'clock, she made a fresh pot of coffee, her movements heavy with fatigue. She poured 2 mugs. She found Franklin where she knew he would be. He was still on his stool in the quarantine wing, the hallway lights casting long, grim shadows. He had his jacket on, the old brown leather one, zipped up against the night's chill. He wasn't reading. He was just sitting, his hand resting on the gate of Wolf's run. And inside, Wolf was asleep. Not a true, deep sleep, but the exhausted, fitful rest of a traumatized animal. He was lying 2 feet from the gate, his nose pointing toward Franklin's hand. Meredith approached slowly, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound. He's asleep, she whispered, her voice full of wonder. Franklin turned his head, his face shadowed. Just resting. He wakes if I move. She handed him one of the mugs. He took it, his cold fingers wrapping around the warmth. He held it, seeming to draw the heat into his hands. You should go home, Meredith said softly, leaning against the opposite wall. You look exhausted. So do you, Franklin replied, his voice a low rumble. Meredith let out a short, bitter laugh. Yeah, well, it was a long day. It's always a long day. She took a sip of her own coffee. I had to euthanize 3 dogs this afternoon. Not for aggression, just for space. Too old, too sick, too unadoptable. We're full. We're always full. She looked down into her mug. Sometimes I wonder what we're even doing here. We save 1 and 5 more come in. I write reports. I give shots. I clean kennels. And then I hold them when they go. It just feels useless sometimes, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Her voice was thick with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was burnout. Franklin recognized it. It was the exhaustion of the heart. Franklin looked at her. He saw her earnest, tired eyes, the faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was young, and she was carrying a weight that was too heavy for her. He looked at Wolf, sleeping fitfully by the gate. He looked at his own hand, the one the dog had almost trusted. "You're not alone," he said, the words surprising him. "In that feeling," he clarified, his gaze drifting to a point on the concrete floor. "The uselessness." He was quiet for a long time, sipping the hot coffee. The only sound was the buzz of the lights. "I had a partner," Franklin said. His voice so low Meredith had to lean in. "Max. He was not like other dogs. He was smarter. He was better." He smiled, a faint, sad twisting of his lips under the beard. He could track a target across 3 clicks of hardpan desert in a sandstorm. He loved the work. He loved me, and I loved him more than most people, I think. Meredith's eyes softened. "He was your K9 in the war." "He was my K9. Franklin nodded. "He was my best friend. He saved my life more than once. I owed him everything." The silence stretched again. Franklin's hand, the one not holding the mug, clenched into a fist. He stared at it as if seeing something on his knuckles. "When it happened, the reports, they said it was unavoidable, an IED, just bad luck, the kind of thing that happens over there." He took a shaky breath. The night air of the shelter suddenly felt like the thin, hot air of Kandahar. "But they don't know," he whispered. "They weren't there. They weren't in my head." He looked up, and for the first time Meredith saw the raw, 15-year-old pain he kept hidden. His eyes were bright, the hard lines of his face broken by a vulnerability that was terrible to see. "It was avoidable," he said, his voice cracking. "I was tired. We all were. We were pushing a 20-hour op. The heat, it was over 120. Max alerted. He gave me the sign. A subtle one, but I knew. He told me something was wrong." He looked down, squeezing his eyes shut. "But I hesitated. A part of me thought, maybe he's just hot. Maybe he's tired. I second-guessed him. I second-guessed Max. Franklin," Meredith whispered, her heart breaking. "I should have pulled back. I should have called EOD, but I didn't." His voice was choked. "I gave a bad command. I told him to check. I sent him forward just a few more feet. I sent him to his death." He opened his eyes, the guilt of 15 years pouring out. "I got him killed, Meredith. I gave a bad command and I got my partner killed. That's the truth. I'm the one. I'm the one who's broken. Not this dog. Me." He turned away from her, his shoulders slumped, as he stared into the kennel at the sleeping dog, a veteran defined not by his service, but by the one terrible mistake he could never outrun. Meredith sat with him in the cold, quiet hallway for a long time. The weight of his confession hung in the air. A 15-year-old specter given new life. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault." She, better than anyone, understood the crushing burden of responsibility, the what-ifs that haunted a life spent around animals. Finally, she stood, taking his empty mug. "Franklin," she said softly, "you're not that man anymore, and you're the only one who can save this dog. Don't let your past kill him, too." She left him alone with the sleeping shepherd. Her words, intended as comfort, felt like a judgment. Don't let your past kill him, too. He stared at Wolf. The 7-day clock was ticking. For days remaining, he was trying to build trust with a traumatized animal, a veteran. But what was he building it on? A lie? He was projecting his own failure onto Wolf, seeing Max's ghost in every flicker of the dog's ears. He wasn't saving Wolf. He was trying to save himself. He realized, with a cold, sickening dread, that he couldn't. He couldn't teach Wolf to trust the world when he couldn't even trust his own memory. The confession to Meredith hadn't freed him. It had only shown him the depth of his prison. He needed to know. He didn't know what he needed. Confirmation, absolution. He had to face the truth. The real truth, not just the story he had told himself for 15 years. He stood up, his joints protesting the cold. Wolf's head lifted instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy," Franklin murmured, his voice thick. "Easy, I'll be back." He walked out of the quarantine wing, past the empty reception desk, and into the sharp, cold New Mexico night. The moon was a sliver, the stars brilliant in the black sky. He drove. He didn't go to his truck to sleep. He started the engine, the sound loud in the silent lot, and pulled onto the highway. He drove past the feed store, past the sleeping town square. He drove to the only place in town that was open all night, the 24-hour gas station on the interstate junction. It was an island of harsh fluorescent light. He parked by the air pump, away from the main building. He walked past the rows of snacks and sodas to the back, where an old, battered pay phone hung on the wall. He hadn't made a call from one of these in. He couldn't remember. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket. It was old, the leather cracked. Tucked behind a flap of fabric was a tiny, faded, folded piece of paper. He hadn't looked at it since 2005. It had one name and one number on it. James. His fingers were stiff, clumsy with cold, and a sudden, paralyzing fear. He fumbled a coin, heard it drop and rattle on the floor. He left it. He pulled out another, his hand shaking. He inserted the coin, lifted the heavy, cold receiver, and punched in the numbers. The sound of the call connecting was unnaturally loud. A mechanical click, a pause, and then a long, distant ringing. Once, twice. On the third ring, a voice answered, thick and rough with sleep. Yeah. Who is this? Franklin's throat was dry. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the phone enclosure. James, it's Franklin. Franklin Hayes. The silence on the other end was absolute. It stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. Franklin could hear the faint electric hum of the open line. He could hear the hum of the gas station's freezers behind him. When James spoke again, his voice was unrecognizable. Gone was the soft, sleepy drawl Franklin remembered. This was a blade cold and sharp, honed to a merciless edge. Franklin. The name landed like a physical blow, an accusation hurled across a chasm of 15 years. After all this time, you're alive. Why are you calling me, James? I just needed to, or you needed what? The dammed-up fury of a decade and a half erupted through the receiver. You vanished, man. Just gone. No funeral, no wake. Not a goddamn word. We thought you were dead. We didn't know what to think. Why the hell are you calling me now, at 3 in the morning? Franklin acknowledged the justice in his anger. He drew a shaky breath. You're right. I'm sorry, James. I couldn't. You couldn't? What about the rest of us, Frank? What about the guys who had to carry his box? What about me? I'm calling about Max. The words escaped Franklin in a low, gravelly rasp. Silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. Then, the crack in James's voice. The sudden, desolate grief replacing the rage. Max, what about him? Franklin squeezed his eyes shut, battling the tremor in his hands. I need to say it, James. I need you to know. It was my fault. A ragged pause. I hesitated. I sent him. I gave a bad command. I got him killed. He braced himself, steeling himself for the inevitable confirmation. For James to finally voice the guilt that had been Franklin's sole companion for 15 agonizing years. Instead, a strange, choking sound emanated from the phone. Not agreement. Disbelief. What are you talking about? Bad command? I hesitated. Franklin repeated, his voice cracking, raw with confession. I should have pulled back. I was tired. I sent him forward. I killed him. Is that what you've been telling yourself for 15 years? James's voice was rising, laced with a frantic energy. Is that why you disappeared? You think it was your fault? It's the truth, Franklin whispered, the words tasting like ash. No, the word was a shout, a violent rejection of Franklin's meticulously constructed reality. No, that's not what happened. Are you crazy? You think it was your fault? Franklin was stunned, his mind reeling, the solid ground of his guilt suddenly shifting beneath his feet. I saw it. The explosion. You saw nothing. James was almost sobbing now, the sound raw and agonizing. You were tired. We were all tired. But Max was perfect. He alerted. You called it. You were right. But the IED, it wasn't where he alerted. It was a decoy, Frank. A setup, a trap for the EOD team. Franklin leaned his head against the cold, unforgiving metal of the phone booth, the world tilting on its axis. What? It was a secondary, James said, his voice thick and wet with unshed tears. A pressure plate aimed at us. Max alerted on the first one, the decoy. But then, he smelled the second one. He knew. He knew it was for us. No, yes. He didn't move forward because of your command, Frank. He moved because I did. James' voice broke completely. I stepped off the line. I was moving toward the decoy. And Max, he lunged. He hit me. He tackled me. Knocked me off the plate. He took the whole blast himself. He saved me, Frank. The receiver trembled in Franklin's grip. He died saving me. James wept, the raw sound tearing through the static. Not you. Me. I was the one he was covering. I was the one who made the mistake. The gas station, the phone, the cold night air. Everything dissolved. Franklin was struck by a truth so profound it almost buckled his knees. 15 years. 15 years of self-imposed exile, of silence, of running from a failure that was never his. His guilt wasn't wrong. It was just misplaced. He wasn't guilty of a bad command. He was guilty of vanishing. He was guilty of leaving James, his teammate, to carry the story, the true story, alone for 15 years. James, Franklin said, his voice hollow, unrecognizable even to himself. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Yeah, James said, his voice raw and spent. That's because you ran. You ran, Frank. And you left the rest of us to deal with it, to deal with him being a hero all by ourselves. The line fell silent. Franklin could hear James taking a long, shuddering breath. I'm glad you're not dead, man, James said finally, the words laced with exhaustion. I really am, but I gotta go. A soft click and the line went dead. Franklin stood in the harsh, buzzing light of the gas station, the dead receiver heavy in his hand. He hadn't been set free. He'd just been handed a different, heavier set of chains. He wasn't a failure. He was a coward. Slowly, he hung up the phone. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. He'd been trying to save Wolf from a ghost, from a mistake that had never happened. Now, the reality of his own failings slammed into him with brutal force. He turned and walked out into the cold, indifferent dark. He got in his truck. He had to go back. Not just to save Wolf from his past, but to save them both from the present. The drive back from the gas station was a blur, the dark highway unspooling in front of his headlights like a ribbon of black ink. But Franklin wasn't seeing asphalt and painted lines. He was seeing a sun-blasted road in Kandahar, the heat shimmering off the parched earth. He was not unburdened. He was rearranged. The crushing, suffocating guilt of failure, the one that had defined him for 15 years, the one that had been his only companion on the mountain, was gone, banished by the brutal light of truth. He had not given a bad command. He had not hesitated. In its place was a different, sharper grief. The grief of cowardice. Max hadn't just died. He had sacrificed himself. He had died a hero, saving James, saving the team. And Franklin had not stayed to honor him. He hadn't stood by his teammates in their grief. He had taken his own grief, wrapped it in a lie, and vanished, leaving them to grapple with the aftermath alone. He had abandoned James to carry the truth of that day, the weight of Max's sacrifice, alone for 15 years. He had let Max's legacy rot, defined by a mistake that never even happened. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the tendons in his forearms straining. He understood now. He wasn't just trying to save a traumatized dog from a 7-day deadline. He was trying to atone for abandoning a hero, for betraying the memory of a selfless act. He arrived back at the shelter as the first thin light of dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised purple. The parking lot was deserted. 3 days left. That's all he had to truly make a difference. He walked with a new, heavy purpose toward the quarantine wing. He heard Wolf stir before he saw him, a low, guttural warning growl, the sound of an animal bracing himself for the day's inevitable torment. Franklin stopped at the key hook by the door. Jared had given him a key after the 7-day order, a reluctant gesture of trust. He unhooked it, the metal cold against his palm. He did not get his stool. He did not get his book. He walked directly to the gate of Wolf's Run, his movements decisive. The dog scrambled to his feet, instantly alert, his body tense. When Franklin didn't stop, didn't sit, didn't offer the familiar, albeit unreliable, comfort of routine, Wolf's growl intensified, escalating into a snarl. He lunged at the gate, hitting it with his front paws, the chain link rattling ominously, a metallic shriek of warning. Stay back. Don't come any closer. Franklin ignored it. He put the key in the heavy padlock. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed unnaturally loud in the confined concrete hallway, each tumbler a hammer blow against the silence. Wolf exploded. He launched himself at the gate with renewed ferocity, barking, a deep, frantic, terrifying sound that resonated with pure, unadulterated fear. He was snapping, his teeth clacking against the chain link, his eyes wide and white with panic, a primal scream trapped in his throat. I will kill you if you come in here. Franklin took a deep, steadying breath. He did not smell the antiseptic bleach of the shelter. He smelled the dust of Afghanistan, the acrid scent of cordite, the metallic tang of blood. He was no longer afraid of his past. He was just tired of running from it. He slid the bolt, the metal protesting with a groan, and opened the gate just enough to slip inside, latching it shut behind him with a decisive click. The click of the latch was like a gunshot in the confined space. Wolf screamed. It wasn't a bark. It was a high-pitched, terrified, desperate sound, the sound of a soul in freefall, as he scrambled backward, crashing into the far concrete wall, a trapped animal with no escape. He was cornered. He was utterly and completely trapped. He snarled, his lips pulled back, revealing his teeth in a menacing display, his body trembling so violently Franklin could see it even from 10 feet away. Franklin did not move. He just stood, his back to the gate, offering the dog the entirety of his small domain. He did not make himself small, submissive. He did not look away, trying to appease the animal. He just stood, a man who had finally, irrevocably stopped running. The dog's frantic snarls filled the air, a cacophony of fear and defiance. But through the haze of panic, Wolf was seeing this man for the first time. This was not the man who sat on the stool, the man who offered fleeting moments of calm before vanishing again. That man was tense, coiled, haunted by something Wolf could smell but not understand. Guilt, fear, hesitation. That man was a threat because he was unpredictable, a walking, talking trigger. This man was different. He was heavy, grounded. He was sad, yes, carrying a burden that seemed to weigh him down. But the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. The restless, guilty energy that had permeated his presence was gone. This man was solid. He was an anchor, and Wolf, adrift in his ocean of terror, had no idea what to do with him. The snarling faltered, losing its edge. It became a low, confused growl, a question mark hanging in the air. The dog's ears were still pinned back against his head, but his head was high, his dark eyes watching, processing, trying to decipher the change in the human before him. Franklin, moving slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to the ground. He did not squat like a handler, poised to spring, ready to react. He sank to his knees, a posture of complete vulnerability, offering himself without reservation. He rested his hands on his thighs, palms open, displaying his lack of threat. He looked at the dog, met his gaze unflinchingly, and Wolf looked back, seeing not an enemy, but a reflection of his own brokenness. He was a hero, Franklin whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears and long-suppressed emotion. Wolf's head tilted slightly, his ears twitching, trying to make sense of the soft, unfamiliar sounds. The growling ceased altogether, replaced by an anxious, high-pitched whine that seemed to emanate from the depths of his being. His name was Max, Franklin said, speaking the words for himself as much as for the dog. He wasn't a failure. He was a hero, and I left him. I ran away. He was not confessing to Wolf. He was confessing in front of him, bearing witness to his own shame. He was laying his broken, rearranged soul bare on the cold concrete floor, offering it as a testament to his cowardice and his belated attempt at redemption. He was a handler with no handler's tricks left, stripped bare of all pretenses. He was just a man, finally telling the truth. Wolf's entire body seemed to deflate, the tension draining from his muscles. The terror that had held him rigid, poised for flight or fight, was being met by a profound, exhausted calm, a recognition of shared suffering. The man was not a threat. The man was broken, wounded, just like him. The dog took one hesitant step forward, then another, his movements tentative, almost apologetic. He moved slowly, his belly low to the ground, his paws silent on the concrete, padding with a newfound gentleness. He stopped just out of Franklin's reach, his black nose twitching, sniffing the air, reading the story etched on the man's face, in the tremor of his voice, in the raw vulnerability of his posture. He smelled the salt of shed tears, the adrenaline of a 15-year-old truth finally surfacing, the quiet desperation of a man seeking forgiveness. Franklin didn't move. He didn't offer a hand, didn't attempt to bridge the gap with a gesture of false reassurance. He just waited, trusting in the silent language of shared pain. Wolf took the last step. He stretched his long gray neck forward, and then, in a gesture of profound, unspoken trust, he pressed his head hard against Franklin's chest, a gentle pressure that spoke volumes. He didn't nudge, didn't lick, didn't offer any of the usual canine overtures of affection. He just pushed, leaning his weight against Franklin as if trying to hold him up, or perhaps to hold himself up, anchoring himself to the only solid thing in his world. Franklin's breath hitched in his throat. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the weight of the dog, the warmth of his fur, the steady thrum of his heartbeat against his own. Slowly, reverently, he raised his hands. He did not pet the dog, did not offer superficial comfort. He cupped the shepherd's broad head, his fingers sinking into the thick, rough fur, and he held him, offering a silent communion of grief and understanding. For the first time since 2005, Franklin Hayes wept. He wept for Max's sacrifice, for the selfless act that had saved a life and condemned him to a decade and a half of agonizing guilt. He wept for James's loneliness, for the burden he had carried in silence, for the friendship fractured by fear and regret. He wept for the 15 years he had lost to a lie, the years he had spent running from a past that had finally caught up with him. He held the traumatized, trembling dog, offering solace and seeking it in return, and the dog held him back, a silent pact forged in the crucible of shared trauma. And in the cold, quiet hallway of the county shelter, two veterans, two broken soldiers, two souls lost in the wilderness of war, began, tentatively, to heal. They stayed that way for a long time, a silent monument of shared scars, a testament to the enduring power of compassion in the face of unimaginable suffering. That night, everything changed. The day had been a triumph. By evening, Franklin had, with painstaking slowness and infinite patience, introduced the muzzle. Wolf hated it, recoiled from it instinctively, the restraint triggering a primal fear. But he had allowed it, had tolerated the unfamiliar pressure, associating it with Franklin's calm presence, his steady reassurance. By 4 o'clock, he had even taken a few tentative steps on a leash inside the run, his body still tense, but his eyes focused on Franklin, seeking guidance, seeking safety. Meredith had watched, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We have it, Franklin," she said, her voice bright with hope. "We can film it tomorrow. We'll beat the deadline. We can save him." Franklin had felt something he hadn't felt in a decade and a half, a flicker of something akin to peace, a fragile ember of hope glowing in the darkness. He decided to drive home to his cabin for a real night's sleep, The first undisturbed rest he'd had in a week, a reward for his efforts, a promise of a better tomorrow. He would be back at dawn, ready to continue the slow, painstaking work of healing. The drive up the mountain was strange, unsettling. The air was heavy, thick with humidity, and an oppressive yellowish-green hue had settled over the valley, casting an eerie pall over the landscape. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no birdsong, just an unnerving silence that pressed down on him. It was the kind of deep, unnatural stillness that comes before a violent break, a pregnant pause before the storm unleashes its fury. He was in his cabin, heating a can of soup for a late supper, when the sky broke open. It was not a gentle rumble, not the distant murmur of thunder rolling across the mountains. It was a sharp, concussive crack that detonated directly overhead, shaking the cabin's windows in their frames, rattling the dishes on the shelves. It sounded exactly like incoming artillery, the dreaded whistle of a shell followed by the earth-shattering boom of its impact. Franklin dropped the metal spoon he was holding. It clattered loudly on the floor, the sound magnified in the sudden silence that followed the thunder. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't even register the sound of the spoon hitting the floor. He vanished. One moment he was standing at the stove, the next he was on the floor, his back pressed against the wall, his head covered with his hands, his body braced for the inevitable shock wave. Asterisk incoming. He was not in New Mexico, not in his quiet mountain cabin. He was in Kandahar, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of ozone, the ground trembling beneath his feet. The years melted away, the present disappeared, and he was once again a soldier, fighting for his survival in a war-torn land. Miles away, in the shelter, the same sound, amplified and distorted by the concrete walls of the quarantine wing, sent another soldier spiraling back into the depths of his trauma. The concrete walls, built like a bunker to withstand the elements, amplified the sound, turning the thunder into a deafening roar that reverberated through the building. Wolf had been asleep, curled up on his worn blanket, dreaming perhaps of open fields and the thrill of the chase. The sound hit him like a physical blow, instantly shattering the fragile peace he had found. He was instantly awake, his heart pounding, his body trembling uncontrollably. He wasn't in a kennel. He was in a war zone, surrounded by explosions, the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. He scrambled to his feet, screaming himself, a high, thin, terrible sound that ripped through the silence, the sound of an animal in pure, blind panic, driven to the edge of madness by the memories that haunted him. Another sharp crack of thunder, this one even louder than the first, rattled the building, shaking the very foundations of the shelter. Wolf threw himself against his kennel door with all his might, driven by an overwhelming need to escape, to find safety, to outrun the demons that were clawing at his mind. It was the same door he had hit for days, the one whose latch was already stressed and damaged from his previous attempts to break free. He hit it once, twice, a 90-pound missile of pure, unadulterated terror, his body fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will to survive. On the third impact, the metal latch, which had only been temporarily secured by Jared after the initial break, finally gave way, the weakened metal failing under the relentless assault. The metal shrieked, a high-pitched wail of protest, and the gate burst open, swinging wildly on its damaged hinges. Wolf was out. He didn't pause, didn't look back, didn't assess his surroundings. He was a gray and white streak of fur and muscle, driven by a PTSD trigger so profound it had stripped him of his reason, his training, his very identity. He was no longer a dog, but a raw nerve, a vessel of pure, unadulterated fear. He ran blindly down the dark hallway, past the empty reception desk, past the darkened offices, driven by a single, overriding instinct: escape. He hit the front door of the shelter, his momentum carrying him forward, only to be met with solid resistance. It was locked, the heavy deadbolt a formidable barrier against his desperate flight. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, searching frantically for another way out. He ran toward the clinic, his paws slipping on the polished floor, and found a cat flap, a large one designed for passing supplies between the inside and outside of the building. He clawed his way through it, his body contorting to fit through the narrow opening, scraping his fur and skin on the rough edges of the plastic. He tumbled out into the night, landing hard on the wet ground, and kept running, propelled by a primal fear that knew no bounds. He ran headlong into the full, furious chaos of the storm. The rain was a solid wall of water, blinding him, soaking him to the bone. The thunder was a constant, rolling explosion, a relentless barrage that threatened to shatter his sanity. He was not running to anywhere, seeking a specific destination or a familiar safe haven. He was running from the war, from the memories that haunted him, from the terror that threatened to consume him. He was simply running, driven by the desperate hope that he could outrun the darkness that had taken root in his soul. The dawn after the storm was unnaturally clear. The sky washed a pale, clean blue, as if the heavens had been purged of the previous night's fury. But the ground told a different story, a tale of chaos and destruction. The wind had torn through the valley, leaving a trail of debris in its wake. Shattered branches littering the ground, overturned trash cans spilling their contents, downed power lines snaking across the road like deadly vipers. David arrived at the shelter for his shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, the early sunlight glinting off the rain-slicked pavement. It was his first day back since the mandatory leave he'd been forced to take for his injury, and he had come prepared, his hand encased in a new, lighter bandage, a tangible reminder of the danger he faced. He was carrying the official 7-day notice, now with only 2 days left on it, clutched tightly in his uninjured hand. He was ready to finalize this, to put an end to the charade and ensure the safety of the community he was sworn to protect. He saw the damage to the quarantine wing before he even got out of his truck, the sight sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. The kennel gate for Wolf was not just unlatched, as he had half expected. It was hanging crookedly on one hinge, the metal bent outward, a testament to the animal's raw power and desperate determination. The concrete floor of the run was slick with muddy paw prints, a clear indication of the path the dog had taken. David's breath caught in his throat, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He did not feel anger first, though that would come soon enough. He felt a cold, prickling dread that started at the base of his neck and spread rapidly through his body, chilling him to the bone. His old trauma, the memory of the mauling 5 years ago, flared instantly, a vivid and horrifying reminder of the potential for violence that lurked beneath the surface of even the most seemingly docile animals. That dog had also been quiet, manageable, until it wasn't. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible, a desperate denial of the reality unfolding before him. He followed the paw prints, his boots crunching on the shattered glass and debris scattered across the floor, his good hand resting instinctively on the tactical flashlight on his belt, ready to draw it at a moment's notice. The prints led down the hallway to the clinic, the trail growing more distinct with each step. He saw the cat flap, the source of the prints. It was broken, shattered into pieces, the jagged shards of plastic scattered on the floor like discarded teeth. It was out. The monster, the liability, the ticking time bomb he had warned them all about was loose in the community. It was loose near the school, near the livestock, near the unsuspecting citizens he was sworn to protect. He scrambled back to his truck, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He didn't call Jared, didn't call Meredith, didn't waste a single second trying to justify his actions or seek permission. He keyed his county radio, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "Dispatch, this is David 14. I have a 1031. He used the code for an animal-related emergency, a signal to the dispatcher that the situation was urgent and required immediate attention. Aggressive Level 4 Shepherd MWD escaped Tal County Shelter. He is loose, dangerous, and a high-risk public threat. I am initiating containment protocols." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady his voice, trying to contain the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "And I am armed." He didn't wait for a reply, didn't need confirmation or approval. He started his truck, the engine roaring to life, and headed for the foothills, his tires spitting gravel as he sped away. He knew, just as Franklin knew, where a scared animal would run. He knew the terrain, knew the hiding places, knew how to track a wounded creature. The phone in Franklin's cabin was a violation, an intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude. It was an old landline, a relic from a bygone era, and its shrill, mechanical ringing was a sound he hadn't heard in months, a jarring reminder of the outside world he had tried so hard to shut out. He had just woken up, his body stiff and sore from sleeping on the floor, the adrenaline from his thunderstorm-induced flashback leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He picked up the receiver, his voice a rough growl, still thick with sleep and the lingering echoes of the storm. "Yeah, Franklin," he said, his tone guarded. Meredith's voice on the other end was high-pitched, frantic, and shattering, each word a shard of broken glass. "He's gone. He's gone." Franklin was instantly awake, the last vestiges of sleep vanishing from his mind, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "Meredith, slow down. Who is gone?" "Wolf. The storm." "Oh, Franklin, the storm last night. The thunder. It must have terrified him. He broke the kennel door. He's gone." Franklin was already pulling on his boots, his movements quick and efficient, his mind racing, assessing the situation, calculating the risks. "Where's Jared?" "I don't know. I just got here. But David's truck is gone, and he's not answering his radio. Franklin, he's hunting him. I know he is. He's going to kill him." Franklin closed his eyes, trying to block out the rising panic in Meredith's voice, focusing on the task at hand. The hard truth from James, the memory of Max's sacrifice, was still fresh in his mind, a driving force that pushed him forward. "He died saving me. And now, another veteran, another wounded soldier was being hunted because he was scared, because he was misunderstood. He couldn't let it happen. Where would he go, Franklin?" She pleaded, her voice desperate. "Up," Franklin said, his voice regaining its calm authority. He grabbed his old brown leather jacket, the familiar weight and smell of it grounding him, reminding him of who he was, of what he was capable of. "He'll go high, away from the noise, away from the chaos. He'll look for a defensible position, a place where he can feel safe, where he can survey his surroundings." He knew exactly where Wolf would be. The old mining operation, abandoned since the 1970s. A maze of rocks and caves, a labyrinth of tunnels and hidden passages. A perfect refuge for a scared and disoriented animal. "Meet me at the base of the old Sonora mine trail." He didn't hang up, didn't waste time with unnecessary words or empty reassurances. He just dropped the receiver onto its cradle and was out the door, his movements swift and purposeful. He drove his truck down the mountain with a controlled speed that was almost reckless, his tires eating up the winding road, his eyes scanning the terrain, searching for any sign of Wolf. He wasn't just a man on a rescue mission. He was a K-9 handler on a mission, a soldier answering the call of duty. He saw them at the trailhead, a chaotic jumble of vehicles and desperate faces. 2 white county trucks parked at odd angles, blocking the narrow access road, and Meredith's small sedan parked haphazardly, as if she had slammed on the brakes and jumped out in a blind panic. David was there, standing rigid and unyielding, and he was not alone. He had 2 other younger officers with him, both looking nervous and ill at ease, their hands hovering near their weapons. David was not nervous. He was rigid with his own fear, which had manifested as cold, terrible certainty, a conviction that he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting the innocent from a dangerous predator. He had a county-issued rifle, unslung and ready, holding it at a low, ready position, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Meredith was standing in front of him, her arms outstretched, her body a fragile barrier against his advance, tears streaming down her face, her voice pleading and desperate. "David, you can't. You don't have the authority. Jared hasn't signed off on this." "I don't need his signature," David said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is an active public threat. That thing mauled me and now it's loose. I have every authority. Now get out of my way, Meredith. This is not your concern. He's not a thing. He's a veteran. He's just scared. So am I," David shouted, his control finally breaking, his voice cracking with the weight of his own trauma. "So am I. And I'm not letting what happened to me happen to some kid walking to school. Now move. He shoved past her, his shoulder knocking her off balance, sending her stumbling backward. He chambered a round into the rifle, the metallic sound of the action. A sharp slide and click, echoing in the cold morning air, horribly final. A death knell for the animal he had already condemned. Put it down, David. Franklin's voice cut through the cold morning air. A low, rumbling sound that commanded attention, that brooked no argument. It was not loud, but it had the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life giving commands that could not be questioned. A man who had faced death countless times and had emerged, scarred but unbroken, on the other side. David spun around, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance, his hand tightening on the rifle. Franklin stepped out of his truck, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence radiating a quiet power that seemed to fill the space around him. He was a tall, lean figure against the bright morning light, silhouetted against the rising sun. He wore the old, unzipped brown leather jacket, its worn leather creaking with age, the collar of his red and navy-plaid shirt visible underneath. His face, framed by the gray-streaked beard, was carved from stone, his eyes like chips of flint, unwavering in their intensity. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the group, his boots crunching on the gravel, his every step measured and purposeful. He stopped about 15 feet from David, his gaze locking onto the younger man's, holding him captive in its unwavering intensity. I said, Franklin repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, each word a carefully weighted stone. Put the rifle down. You stay out of this, old man, David said, his knuckles white on the rifle, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. You're the one who agitated him, who let him out in the first place. This is on you. I'm finishing it. He's not a threat, Franklin said, his voice unwavering, his eyes never leaving David's. He's a soldier. He's trapped. He's calling for help. That's not help he's calling for, David sneered, his fear making him cruel, twisting his features into a grotesque parody of a smile. That's how they sound before they rip your arm open. I know that sound. Then you should know the sound of a man who's giving you a lawful order. A new voice boomed, cutting through the tension like a thunderclap. A dark sedan, an old police interceptor model with tinted windows and a reinforced frame, had pulled up, blocking the trail completely, its imposing presence a clear statement of authority. Jared got out of the car, his movements stiff but purposeful. He was not the tired, slumped shelter director they were used to seeing, the man who shuffled paperwork and wrung his hands over budgets. He was wearing an old dark windbreaker with the faded letters *TPD stenciled on the breast, a relic from his past. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his back straight, his old police captain's authority radiating from him like a physical force, a palpable wave of command and control. He walked directly between Franklin and David, his presence a solid wall of resolve, preventing any further escalation. He looked at David, his gaze flat and hard as iron, his eyes conveying a message that brooked no argument. David, I know what you're thinking, Jared said, his voice a firm but controlled command. I know what you're remembering, but this is not that day, and this is not that dog. You are emotionally compromised. Give me the rifle. Jared, I have the authority. No, you don't, Jared snapped, his voice sharper now, brooking no argument. He gestured with his hand, a silent signal, and the other two officers took a step back, distancing themselves from the escalating confrontation. You have a recommendation, a suggestion. I am the director of this facility. That dog is shelter property, and he is under my jurisdiction until that 24-hour deadline expires, or until I sign the paper. And I haven't signed it. He pointed a finger at David's chest, his gaze unwavering. You're hunting my property. You're threatening a civilian, he gestured toward Franklin. And you are standing down. That is a direct order. The standoff was absolute. A moment of frozen tension. A battle of wills fought in silence. David's face was pale, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting back and forth between Jared and Franklin, his body trembling with the effort to maintain control. He was at war with his own trauma, his own fear, and he was losing. Slowly, with a shaking hand, he lowered the rifle, the barrel pointing toward the ground, the threat contained. For now. Jared did not relax, did not let down his guard. He turned his back on David, a calculated gesture of dominance, a clear signal that the younger man was no longer a threat. He faced Franklin, his expression softening slightly, his gaze shifting from command to respect. He looked at the mountain, its rugged slopes rising toward the clear blue sky, then at the man who stood before him, a part of that landscape, a force of nature in his own right. "You were right," Jared said, his voice softer now, tinged with a hint of regret. "About everything. I was so busy managing the rules, so focused on adhering to the procedures, I forgot to manage the problem, to see the animal, to understand the situation." He nodded to Franklin, acknowledging the truth in his words, the wisdom in his actions. "You were inspired to help him, to see the good in him, to believe in him. And frankly, Franklin, watching you, seeing the way you've worked with him, you've inspired me." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the trail, offering Franklin a chance to act, a chance to save the animal they had both failed. "You know where he is, don't you?" "I know where he'll be hiding," Franklin said, his voice resolute, his eyes focused on the mountain, seeing the path ahead, knowing what he had to do. "Go get him," Jared said, his voice filled with a newfound trust, a faith in. The trail was a desperate narrative etched in mud and splintered wood, a chaotic symphony of flight. Franklin saw where Wolf had lost his footing, the frantic claw marks raking the earth, the snapped branch screaming of panicked force. This wasn't a simple escape. This was a full-blown retreat, the kind born of primal terror. A cold certainty settled in Franklin's gut. He knew precisely where this frantic path would lead. He, too, had once sought sanctuary in oblivion, in places where the world couldn't reach. The Sonora mine, a jagged wound on the mountainside, had been dormant since the 70s. It was a treacherous labyrinth of decaying machinery, unstable shale slopes, and yawning, light-swallowing holes, a monument to forgotten industry and shattered dreams. The perfect foxhole for a wounded, terrified soldier, animal or otherwise. He crested the final ridge, his lungs burning with a steady rhythm, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape. Silence. Only the mournful sigh of the wind weaving through the skeletal branches of the pinyon pines. "Wolf," he called, his voice a low, soothing balm against the harshness of the mountain. Not a command, but a gentle murmur, barely audible above the wind's lament. "It's okay. I'm here." Only silence answered. Yet he knew the dog was close. The sheer force of that panic had likely drained him, left him trembling and spent. He moved cautiously towards the main processing area, a desolate expanse of flattened rock strewn with the rusted corpses of forgotten equipment. "Easy, soldier," he murmured, directing his words into the wind. "We're just talking. No need to be afraid." Then he heard it, not a bark, but a guttural, rattling growl that resonated deep within the earth, an idling engine of pure desperation. It was emanating from below. Driven by the sound, Franklin approached the edge of a narrow chasm, a dark, vertical scar slicing through the rock, a collapsed mine entrance, a jagged wound roughly 8 feet wide and 20 feet deep. He peered into the abyss. A pair of amber eyes, blazing with primal terror, stared back from the inky blackness. Wolf. He was wedged at the bottom, trapped. He must have been blindly fleeing through the storm's fury, only to be swallowed by this forgotten maw. He was struggling to stand, but his right hind leg splayed at an unnatural angle, pinned by a vicious tangle of rusted rebar and loose rock. He was caught. As Wolf registered Franklin looming above, he lunged with what little strength he possessed, snapping at the air, his teeth clacking like desperate castanets, his body trembling with a furious, heart-wrenching growl. Cornered, injured, and ready to fight to the death. Franklin's heart ached. He didn't see a monster, a feral beast. He saw the stark reality of a soldier's end, the bitter culmination of a path paved with duty and sacrifice. He unzipped his worn, brown leather jacket, revealing the familiar plaid of his flannel shirt beneath. He needed to reach him, but a direct descent into that black pit was impossible. It was a sheer drop to certain injury or worse. He skirted the ravine's edge, his eyes scanning for an alternative. 20 yards down, the rock face sloped, offering a treacherous, steep slide of loose shale and gravel, terminating in a narrow ledge perhaps 5 feet above Wolf's desperate prison. It was a desperate gamble, but the only option. Franklin sat on the edge, dug his heels into the loose earth, and began his descent. The abrasive screech of rock against rock sent Wolf into another paroxysm of panic. Franklin slid faster than intended, the sharp gravel tearing at the palms of his hands and the tough hide of his jacket. He slammed into the ledge, the impact stealing his breath. He winced, his hands throbbing. Wolf, now utterly frantic, snapped at the rock wall, then at his own trapped leg, his terror amplified by the new threat that had invaded his confinement. "Easy," Franklin gasped, his voice a raw rasp. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." He made no move to approach. He remained seated on the ledge, his legs dangling, a mere 5 feet above the terrified animal. He stayed there, his back pressed against the cold, unyielding stone, and simply waited. He allowed the silence to stretch, to fill the void. He allowed Wolf's panic to exhaust itself, to burn through its frantic energy. The dog snarled, barked, and finally, depleted, subsided into a continuous, low, desperate growl that spoke of pain and utter hopelessness. Franklin glanced at his left hand. The slide had ripped the palm open, the wound weeping a steady stream of dark blood onto the unforgiving rock. He reached into his jacket pocket. K9 handler was always prepared. He retrieved a small, well-worn canvas first aid kit. Wolf tracked his every movement, his head low, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Franklin opened the kit, retrieved a cleansing wipe, and hissed as the antiseptic seared the raw wound. Slowly, methodically, he began to bandage his own hand. "He was a hero," Franklin said, his voice hushed, the words echoing softly within the ravine. Wolf's growl faltered, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar sound. "Max, my partner," Franklin continued, meticulously wrapping the gauze. "I told Meredith I got him killed. I told myself that for 15 years. I hid on that mountain, Wolf. I hid from that lie because I thought it was the truth." He secured the bandage, his gaze fixed on his wrapped hand, then dropping to the trapped dog. "But it wasn't the truth. The truth? The truth is harder. He was a hero. He saw a trap, a secondary device aimed at us, at me and my friend. And he didn't hesitate. He took it. He took the whole blast. He died saving us." Wolf whined, a high-pitched, anxious sound. He was listening, somehow understanding. "And I ran," Franklin said, his voice thick with a shame he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge until now. "I ran away from his memory. I ran away from my team. I left my friend James to carry that story all by himself. I've been trapped, Wolf, trapped under that cowardice for 15 years. He looked down at the shepherd, his legs still ensnared by rusted metal. "We've both been trapped, haven't we, soldier? Me by a lie. You by whatever those men did to you, by the thunder, by this hole." He took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling his lungs. "But today we get out. Both of us." Franklin rose to his feet on the narrow ledge. He unbuckled his thick leather belt, the one he'd worn for 2 decades, and slid it free from the loops of his jeans. He looked down. "I'm coming down. Hold tight, soldier." Wolf, hearing the familiar command, instinctively lowered his head, his body trembling. Carefully, Franklin lowered himself off the ledge, dropping the final 5 feet to the ravine floor, landing lightly. Wolf snarled, a reflexive response, but he didn't lunge. He was too weak, too scared, and perhaps, just perhaps, too curious. "Easy, easy," Franklin murmured, his voice a soothing balm. He didn't approach the snarling mouth, but focused on the trapped leg. "I see the problem. We'll fix it." He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man defusing a bomb, each movement precise and measured. He looped his belt, feeding the buckle through the end, creating a makeshift slip lead. He held it out. Okay, this is just a tool. This is just to help. He slid it slowly over Wolf's head and onto his thick neck. Wolf flinched but allowed it, too exhausted to fight. Good boy, Franklin whispered. Gutter Yunga. He tightened it just enough to provide a secure hold, but not to choke. He examined the trapped leg. The rebar was twisted, but the rock was loose. Franklin gripped the largest piece of rock and, with a grunt of exertion, hauled it free. Wolf yelped, a sharp, piercing sound of pain as the pressure released. He was free, but he was lame. He tried to stand, but his hind leg wouldn't bear his weight. I know, Franklin said, his voice laced with empathy. I know it hurts. He surveyed the ravine. The way he had come in was impossible to climb back up, especially with an injured dog. But at the far end, 20 yards away, a rockfall had created a steep, narrow, sloping path, a goat path, almost vertical but a way out. This is the hard part, Franklin said, gently tugging the belt. We have to climb. I'm with you. We go together. He began to climb, scrambling up the first few feet of loose rock. He looked back. Wolf was standing on 3 legs, whining, torn between the terror of being abandoned and the agony of movement. Franklin descended. He placed his hand on Wolf's broad head. You are a soldier. You are a hero. You will not die in this hole. He delivered the command, not with anger, but with the deep, unwavering certainty of a handler. Up, come up. Wolf looked at him, his amber eyes reflecting a flicker of hope. He saw the path, the man, and he made his choice. With a pained whimper, he placed his front paws on the first rock. He scrambled, his injured leg dragging uselessly behind him. Again, Franklin commanded, moving just ahead, using the belt as a guide, not a leash. Up. It was an agonizing, desperate climb. Wolf was 90 pounds of dead weight and adrenaline. Franklin was scrambling, pulling, his own body screaming in protest. They slipped. Rocks tumbled down. Wolf cried out as his legs struck the stone. But he pressed on, driven by the command, fueled by trust in the voice above. They were a mess of dirt, blood, and sweat. Franklin was hauling. Wolf was scrambling. 2 broken souls moving as one. A single unit forged in desperation and unbreakable trust. Franklin reached the final edge, heaving himself over the top. He turned, braced his feet, and pulled. One more up. Wolf gave a final, desperate lunge and collapsed onto the flat, solid ground of the trailhead. His sides heaving, his mouth agape, gasping for air. He was out. He was free. Franklin unclipped his belt and collapsed beside the dog, his back against a boulder. He was panting, his hand bleeding again through the bandage, his leather jacket torn. Wolf, still whimpering from the pain in his leg, crawled the last few feet and rested his head in Franklin's lap. He began to lick the blood from Franklin's torn hand. Franklin simply sat there, gazing up at the pristine blue sky, and allowed him to. The descent was a slow, agonizing process. Franklin had fashioned a makeshift leash and harness from his leather belt, looping it under Wolf's chest to help support his weight. The shepherd, exhausted and in pain, leaned heavily against Franklin's leg, but he moved, one limping, painful step at a time. He didn't pull. He didn't fight. The frantic, terrified animal that had fled into the storm was gone, replaced by a soldier, wounded but resolute, who had chosen his leader. For Franklin, each step down the mountain was an inversion of the life he had constructed. For 15 years, he had climbed up to escape, to isolate himself from the world and the ghosts that haunted him. Now he was climbing down, supporting the weight of another, and walking back into the world he had abandoned. As they emerged from the pinyon trees onto the flat gravel of the trailhead, the search party remained, frozen in a tableau of apprehension and relief. Meredith was the first to see them. She had been pacing anxiously, wringing her hands, and stopped abruptly, a sound half sob, half gasp, escaping her lips. Franklin, Jared spun around, his professional composure momentarily dissolving in a wave of profound relief. Even the two younger officers, who had been leaning against their truck, straightened, their expressions shifting from boredom to concern. They were a sorry sight. Franklin, caked in mud and his own drying blood, his plaid shirt and leather jacket ripped and torn, his face etched with exhaustion and grim determination. And Wolf, a gray and white specter, his fur matted and filthy, his hind leg held completely off the ground, but his head held high, his gaze unwavering, fixed on Franklin, his every movement radiating trust. The tension returned, but it was different now, focused on a single figure. David. He had been standing apart, his rifle now slung over his shoulder, his face pale and unreadable. He watched them approach, his eyes not on Franklin, but on the dog. He saw the limp, the pain, and he saw something no one else had ever seen, a wolf walking calmly on a slack lead, his entire being focused on the man beside him. The dog wasn't a monster, a killing machine. He was just a dog, a broken creature seeking solace and direction. Meredith started to run forward. "Oh, Franklin, his leg." "Easy," Franklin cautioned, his voice low, holding up his bandaged hand. "He's okay. He's calm. Let's keep him that way." It was David who moved. He didn't speak. He turned stiffly, walked to his county truck, and opened the large side panel toolbox. He retrieved a heavy, bright orange professional medical kit. He walked towards them, and Meredith flinched, stopping in her tracks. Franklin stood his ground, positioning himself slightly in front of Wolf, a silent shield. David stopped 10 feet away, not attempting to close the distance. He met Franklin's gaze, his eyes hard, but the manic fear was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He was all business, his personal demons momentarily subdued by the call of procedure. He placed the large kit on the gravel between them. "That leg needs stitches now," David said, his voice clipped and professional. "He'll have nerve damage if it's not cleaned and splinted. My kit has everything." He looked at the dog one last time, then back at Franklin, his expression a mixture of profound, exhausted confusion and grudging respect. He said nothing more. He simply turned, stepped back, and retreated to his truck, leaning heavily against the door. His part in this strange drama finally concluded. It was his concession, his acknowledgement of a reality he had stubbornly refused to see. Jared stepped forward, taking charge. "Meredith, you and I, let's get him to the clinic, gently." Franklin knelt beside Wolf, who whimpered softly and licked his face. "It's okay, soldier," Franklin whispered, his voice full of tenderness. "These are friends. You're safe now." He unclipped his belt from Wolf's neck and surrendered the shepherd to their care. He watched as they carefully, gently, lifted the 90-pound dog into a transport carrier. He watched his new, fragile purpose being driven away to the clinic. He was left standing alone at the trailhead, covered in blood and dirt, suddenly, terribly unsure of what came next. Jared stood beside him, holding a small first aid kit from his car. "Your hand," he said, offering it. Franklin glanced at his own torn, bandaged palm. He had forgotten the pain. He nodded, and Jared began to awkwardly but efficiently clean and redress the wound. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Jared said quietly, taping the gauze. "And I don't just mean the climb. I mean what you did for David." Franklin glanced over at David, who was still staring at the ground, lost in his own internal battle. "He's trapped," Franklin murmured. "Same as the dog." "Yeah," Jared agreed. He finished the bandage. "You have a way of seeing that, don't you?" Jared surveyed Franklin, taking in his old leather jacket, the plaid shirt, the uniform of a man who didn't belong, who existed on the fringes. "There's a cottage," Jared said, gesturing towards the back of the shelter property, where a small, run-down stucco building sat beneath the shade of a sprawling cottonwood tree. "It's been empty for years. Used to be for the groundskeeper. The plumbing mostly works. Roof's good." Franklin just looked at him, not understanding. "It's not much," Jared continued, "but it's quiet. It's here and it's yours if you want it. Jared, I can't pay. I'm broke. I'm not talking about rent. Jared's voice was serious, earnest. Meredith, she's got a list. 3 other dogs in the back. A hound that won't let anyone touch it. A shepherd mix that came from a fighting ring. Dogs I was saving for a miracle. Dogs I was hiding from David. He looked Franklin directly in the eyes. I think you're the miracle, Franklin. The cottage is yours. The job, if you want it, is to just keep doing what you're doing. Help me. Help them. Franklin gazed at the small cottage, its peeling paint and overgrown garden hinting at a forgotten life. He glanced towards the clinic, where he could hear Meredith's low, soothing voice. He thought of his cold, silent cabin on the mountain, a 15-year prison he had built for himself. He had run to that mountain to escape his past. But his past, Max's heroism, James' grief, wasn't something to escape. It was something to honor, something to carry forward. He turned back to Jared. I'll need to get my things, he said, a flicker of hope igniting in his weary eyes. Months later, the first snow of the season had dusted the valley, transforming the landscape into a serene winter wonderland. The small stucco cottage was no longer run down. The broken fence had been mended, and a new, secure 6-foot fence enclosed the small yard. A thin curl of wood smoke rose lazily from the chimney, painting a picture of warmth and domesticity. On the porch, bathed in a patch of winter sun, Wolf lay sleeping peacefully. He was magnificent. His gray and white coat was thick and clean. His eyes closed in contented slumber. His back leg had healed, leaving him with a slight, stiff gait, but it didn't slow him down, didn't diminish his spirit. He was home, but Franklin wasn't on the porch. He was standing beside one of the isolated kennel runs, the very one that had once held Wolf. Inside, a trembling hound mix huddled in the corner, its eyes wide with fear. Seated on a 3-legged stool 6 feet from the gate was a young man in his early 20s. He was tense, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. This was Mike, a veteran of a more recent war, his body still carrying the invisible scars of trauma. I don't get it, Mike said, his voice tight with frustration. I sit here. I do nothing. He just keeps shaking. Franklin, no longer the silent man of the mountain, stood calmly, leaning against the fence, his presence a reassuring anchor. You are doing something, Mike. You're teaching him that your presence doesn't equal pain. Stop watching the dog, Mike. Watch the air around the dog. He's not scared of you. He's scared of what you might do. You just have to sit there, quiet and still, until he learns you're not going to. Mike nodded, taking a shaky breath, his gaze fixed on the trembling hound. How long did it take you with Wolf? Franklin glanced towards his cottage, where Wolf had just lifted his head, his gaze unwavering, watching over them. Longer than it should have, he admitted, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. But I had to learn the same lesson. Meredith approached, a clipboard clutched in her hand. She wasn't just a vet anymore. She was a program director, a catalyst for healing and hope. She smiled warmly at the scene. He's right, Mike, she affirmed. Just breathe. She turned to Franklin. The donor check came through, the one from James. Franklin smiled, a genuine expression of joy. The phone call with James had led to another, and another, the first tentative steps of 2 old friends finding their way back to each other, bridging the chasm of guilt and regret. He's a good man, Franklin said, his voice filled with gratitude. Our first Warriors and Friends meeting is next week, Meredith announced, tapping the clipboard. We've got 5 handlers and 5 dogs. You ready? Franklin looked at Mike, still sitting bravely on the stool, facing his own fears as he tried to help another. He looked at the terrified hound, a mirror reflecting the pain and uncertainty they both carried. He looked at his cottage, his home, a sanctuary built on second chances and unwavering trust. Wolf had risen and was walking towards him, his tail giving a low, slow wag, a silent greeting, a gesture of unwavering loyalty. Franklin placed his hand on Wolf's broad, strong head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath his fingertips. He was no longer the silent, solitary man of the mountain. He was just Franklin, and he was finally home. "Yeah," Franklin said, his voice calm and, for the first time in 15 years, filled with purpose. "I'm ready." Franklin and Wolf's journey reminds us that our deepest wounds are often invisible and that true healing rarely happens in isolation. It teaches us that sometimes the only way to save ourselves is to be brave enough to save someone else. If this story of patience and second chances touched your heart, we would be honored to read your own reflections in the comments below. Please consider sharing this story with someone who might need to hear it and join our community by subscribing so we can continue to share these journeys. The next tale is already waiting for you, and we hope you'll join us for it.